I just wanted to very quickly touch upon one dimension that I think sets some of the backdrop for what they'll talk about today, which is just one of my earliest sort of interests in pursuing this topic, which was the concept of the rogues gallery, which has been around since the 19th century, and essentially was a way that early police precincts would organize criminal portraits in these kind of giant cabinets, which you can see at the back of the room. And what I was particularly interested in and was surprised to discover was that from the earliest days that they were implemented, there was also a public component, and that those police precincts encouraged members of the public to come in and to view those portraits, not only for the purposes of identifying criminals and helping with investigations, but also as a form of entertainment. And so, as I started thinking about it, I became clued into the work of both Paolo and Sarah, actually from quite early on, and started sort of trying to figure out how it was that we were still in a position today, somehow, whereby these kinds of records, and particularly criminal portraits, are publicly available, knowing now, as we have from the very earliest days, the incredible stigma of guilt that's carried with the portrait itself, even when it's a portrait simply of someone accused and not necessarily convicted of a crime. So I think the two of them will be able to speak much more to the kind of contemporary dimensions of the work and how those kinds of problems manifest themselves today, especially in the age of the internet, where any kind of record of your activity tends to be quite difficult to eradicate once it sort of pops up online. So just to very quickly introduce the two of them, and then they'll take it away and talk a bit about each of their individual projects. Here we have Paolo Cirio, who is an Italian conceptual artist, an activist whose work has been exhibited widely and internationally at the ICP in New York, at the Victoria and Albert Museum and Tate in London, Museum for Photography in Berlin, MoCA Sydney, and many, many more institutions that you probably are familiar with. And he regularly gives public lectures and workshops at a wide range of leading universities and art institutions. And his research mainly consists, and also intervention-based work, of kind of investigations into various social fields that have been impacted by the internet, related to questions around privacy and democracy, finance and intellectual property. Over the course of his work, I think he's received probably an inordinate number of legal threats, which might be seen as a kind of badge of pride from global conglomerates with accounts in the Cayman Islands to Google itself, the kind of #1 internet watchdog of today. So the work that he's going to talk about now, the Obscurity project, you can see some parts of there on that desk. So I urge you all to have a look around the gallery later. But aside from just reporting on kind of mass incarceration in the United States and the impact of mugshots, his work led to the founding of a very important movement called Right to Remove, which advocates for the legal right to remove personal information from search engines. And Sarah herself also sits on the advisory board of the Right to Remove organization. And their work has intersected in quite a lot of interesting ways, which hopefully they can talk about as well. And Sarah Lageson is a sociologist who specializes in the relation between criminal justice, technology, and inequality. And her current work focuses primarily on the growth of online crime data and mugshots and criminal records that have created new forms of digital punishment. She received the National Institute of New Justice New Investigator Early Career Award for her study of criminal records, and she's currently working as an assistant professor at Rutgers University, Newark School of Criminal Justice. She co-authored a book last year called Give Methods a Chance, Interviews with Social Scientists, and she has another book forthcoming, which we can all look out for, with Oxford University Press, called Digital Punishment. So without further ado, I think, Paolo, maybe you want to start out and introduce your work?
Yes. Well, thanks everyone for being here, and thanks Elizabeth for having done this amazing show. I invite everyone to read her essay because it's amazing piece of writing, and it really explain everything about this show, but also this kind of material, and especially the research that she's doing, and all the issues that she has been connecting, and also this amazing opportunity to show this piece, Obscurity, and to talk about this issue, because this has been probably the most challenging project that I ever done. It's probably more than 4 years of work, and it's a very important issue, but nevertheless it's been very difficult to show around, because it's a very concrete artwork in a way, on a real serious matters. And sometimes the New York art scene, but also just in the US, is very difficult to bring this kind of discussion with art. And apexart art is actually one of the very few left in New York, if not in the country, that is a venue for this kind of work on social justice. Anyhow, thanks so much, and thanks, Sarah, for having accepted this invitation. The project is, I started this project, as I said, 4 years ago, and I do a lot of internet art, and one big subject is surveillance and privacy online. And I started to use the photographic material, and I was just brainstorming, trying to figure out what was going to be my next project, and that means a lot of readings, article, and stuff like that. At one point, I discovered these issues about the Mugshot site, which for me as a European was actually a pretty new discovery, I would say. That was probably 2015, and then I just was shocked just about the fact that those things were existing, and there were very few articles they were talking about this issue, and nevertheless that was connected to another important concern that I had, that was the right to be forgotten, that as a European and as privacy activist was a pretty interesting concept, and just like as privacy right. And so then I started to brainstorm on it, and then I started to just get this data, just because I also found it a very interesting material to some degree. And so that was a very technical challenge to collect actually criminal data and these mugshots, these pictures. That was also done through another assistant that I had, because it was technically very challenging to collect over, I guess in total they were 20 million mugshots from the mugshot site directly. So basically these mugshot sites, they do what they do. They scrape, they collect this data from the website of the jails, county jails, small jails, but also bigger jails, sometimes directly from the court sites. And then they aggregate all this data on their own website, and then they republish them on the internet. I mean, it's just a website, right? But eventually those sites contain names and booking data and pictures, actually the worst picture that you could ever find online, these portraits, these mugshots. And when you look for someone, a name and surname of someone, you might end up to be on this, land on this website, simply because you would search on Google for these names. And Google would just show the first results. And eventually these people don't, they don't do anything else in life. It's not they have a CV online, or they have social media presence. So it's the only thing that you could find about these people is actually their mugshots. and their crime or assumption of crime is there. So basically, it did the same, really. And so I collected this a huge amount of data from their site. So instead of like taking from the jail, I actually took from them. That was actually easier for me because the data was already collected state by state and from 6 websites, pretty much. And then it was another difficult process to figure out what to do with this material, because it was very interesting, but I wanted to make an intervention about it. I want to address these issues, but also not exposing or like ending up to reproduce the same system of those sites. But at the same time also producing like, some outcomes, because my work is also very interventionist. So in my process, I always think how these will generate some some reactions from the site, some interaction from whoever is responsible for that, and eventually also for the people that unfortunately were affected by this. And I have to say, slowly it started to work out, because I republished this data blurred, so the pictures were blurred and the name were shuffled. And then I pushed this data again in the search engine's results, so that basically now, not now anymore, but when the project was very active, when you search for someone that has been arrested, eventually you see first my website and then the original site. But when you click on my site that looks exactly like the original, you won't find the actual person picture and the actual real name. So basically, it's a hijacking the traffic from the original Mugshot sites. And it also ruins their reputation, because eventually people that used to think that that was a good tool to search for someone, they would realize, no, this doesn't actually work. Which is actually a reality, because most of this data that's out there is totally inaccurate. And you cannot rely on, first of all, there is no context. So basically, even if you find someone that has been arrested there and says that whatever was the crime, you don't know if the cops that arrested that person really reported the crime correctly, and then you don't know if the site itself published that data correctly. So basically, it's totally unreliable data. But the site itself would anyhow monetize the viewing of that data. They don't care if it's actually accurate. So, and that is a lot of views, it's a lot of traffic, and the internet traffic is money. And we talk about a lot of money and traffic because there are, we say 80 million of these individuals that have been arrested in the United States in the past 20 years, and they have a criminal record that eventually ends up on the internet. And so you can think how many people actually look up for their name, they try to figure if that picture is online, and their friend too, their families. And that's actually what happened also with my project, because once I made these sites, these 6 obfuscated sites, the traffic on the site became insane, to the point that the site themselves went down because of too much traffic. And then people start to write me about their story, also because attached to these obfuscated sites also started this campaign that was meant to address the problem in a way that became activists to enact legislation to stop this publication of mugshots, but also to talk about the right to be forgotten, this particular privacy right that we have in Europe, but it's not in US. So anyhow, there were means that I left on the site for the project to contact me in a way. And the reactions were very interesting. Most of them are actually people who have been affected, and they tell me the story, or they report the story. Most people also are very confused about what's going on, because they don't understand the internet, they don't understand why that data is out there first place. And they don't understand my project, because what's going on. So there is 2 sites, one has my picture and one is picture blurred, but it's not my name. and but they look exactly the same. But then there is this another project. This is not someone asked me money. This someone else actually just say that's a legal right. So for people that unfortunately in this country don't know these media sophistications, it's very confusing. They don't know what to do. And so sometimes they were just emails. They were just saying, look, I just need to remove this data, whatever. And so in some cases, at the beginning, I started to reply, and then it became just too overwhelming, because we are talking about hundreds of people writing, and those stories are very heartbreaking and very insane. And some people instead understood very well what was going on, and they were affected, and they addressed their story, their issue directly to me as an art activist. And in that case, I was following up. I was trying to help these people to give some suggestions as much as I could. But then this grew to the point that I wanted to do more about this project, because it was more than just like the blurred picture, or the intervention, or the provocation, or the concept. It just became also about these people's lives, and they were relying on me because there was basically no one else doing it. There were few scattered people across the countries that considered themselves activists, but they were very small, and they were not connected, and they were not supported by any institution, any organization. And so I developed this campaign more, and I made a mailing list for them. And now on this site of the Right to Remove, which is not an important organization, but it's anyhow something that I did, and where I try to mobilize people that believe in this. And they started to exchange messages and advices, and it became a kind of like sort of small community. For them, or at least like a self-support, let's say. And nevertheless, then I start to be very engaged in trying to figure out how the legislation work, how I could really, address this to Google, the search engines themselves, and these activists themselves. They were trying to track down the owner of those mugshot sites, and they are very specialized in that. And then is how I met also Sarah, that I already knew through her writing, pretty much when I started to research on this project. And then somehow I figured that you were based in Brooklyn, and then somehow we met, and then we went along, and you understood completely what was going on. Of course, it's one of your main research. And and then the project grew, and we managed to start to get some press together about it, and some other member of the community knew your work as well. And yes, and now we are here, which is pretty amazing. Yes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for arranging this and for the invitation. And thank you all for being here on a sunny Saturday. Appreciate it. So my name is Sarah, and I work as an assistant professor at Rutgers University, but I've been writing about and researching more broadly just how technology is changing the criminal justice system. And a lot of technologies that are imported are brought to criminal justice agencies with this idea of transparency and efficiency and accountability, and that data will get us there. But what I've noticed in doing this work is that often the data that are collected are not used for the benefit of the public to see inside of criminal justice operations any more than we were in a paper-based system. Instead, this data is what some have called operating as a reverse sunshine effect. So instead of transparency, for us to watchdog agencies, we now have this unfettered access to watchdogging one another. And we created this sort of internet-based cultural, legal surveillance over millions and millions of people. So my lens into trying to understand this has been fieldwork and interviews with hundreds of people who have been impacted by digital punishment, but also are the purveyors and the publishers of digital punishment, and to try to understand how the First Amendment and public records laws are being manipulated, used for sometimes what people feel are very important moral projects. Other people use them for extortion schemes. We've talked about the mugshot websites where you are charged thousands of dollars to have your photo removed. And then also people whose lives have been devastated by these small interactions with the justice system. So I thought I'd talk very briefly about some of the kind of core qualities of what this sort of digital punishment looks like. And the first is that it's very disordered. And Paolo brought up this accuracy point, and I think that's really important, is that when a public record is created, it is all of our First Amendment right to take that public record, disseminate it, write about it, publish it. And we have these incredible systems in place for data accuracy for things like medical records or for credit reports. There's been massive federal regulation about privacy and accuracy in that domain. Criminal justice is not like that. These records are used as criminal records and as stigmatizing records about people, but the agencies claim these are just their historical records of who's been processed through a jail or who's gone into a courtroom. And so there's this odd mismatch of accountability. Criminal justice is very local. Everything happens at the county level. Decision-making, new technologies as they're implemented, these are all small decisions that multiply across the internet at a very fast rate. So often people in the studies that I've done, they have no idea that these things are on the internet until they come up in a very unexpected and sort of terrifying way, especially for people who maybe were arrested once in the 80s or the 90s. And a court system or a county jail will get a new software package, which is sold to them on the private market, and they'll implement it, and they'll digitize all their records and immediately put them on the internet. And so things come up from decades ago, especially the non-conviction records. People don't even remember the scenario anymore because it's so far in their past, and suddenly this photograph is the first Google search result. And so it's often inaccurate, it's outdated, it's misleading, and yet it's very, very salient. The websites that monetize public records are very good at search engine optimization. Like Paolo said, a lot of people don't have a lot of search results. They're just regular people. So when you have a website that is designed to come up first, this is going to be it's going to take over a person's entire internet reputation. And it's hard because in criminal justice reform world, reputation and privacy aren't the easiest things for legislation to deal with, right? We can talk about employment discrimination based on types of records. We can talk about people losing certain rights because of certain types of convictions. This non-conviction arrest mugshot arena has been really, really difficult to legislate. And it's been hard to get media attention because, rightfully so, journalists are concerned about the First Amendment implications. If they're writing about the work we're doing, they're also saying that they may have to concede some of their internet rights. And so it becomes very delicate. The commodification of the records has been sort of mind-bending for me. Public records are made public because they're supposed to be a social good. And instead, data brokers have created this enormous industry without the sort of Fair Credit Reporting Act regulatory scheme that we think of when we think of background checks. Instead, these are just big databases that are merged based on addresses, sometimes phone numbers, photographs. It's not good data, but it's extremely valuable. And so there's this sort of middleman market between your consumer background check companies and the companies that are selling software to criminal justice agencies to aggregate this data, repackage it, and sell it. And they're doing so without really any regulation or oversight. These records are surveilling, they pop up. And by surveilling, I don't just mean they embarrass people, they change people's behavior. So many people that I've talked to, once they figured out that this record was out there and it was so unmanageable, they would try to email a website and no one would write them back. They would try to call a lawyer and realize they A, couldn't afford one, or B, the lawyer was like, I don't actually know what law is being violated. This is a public record. I don't know what I can help you with. So they would start to opt out of social situations that would trigger an internet search for them. So volunteering at their kids' schools, meeting the other parents, online dating, right? So all these things that in criminology we know contribute to people's ability to move on from a criminal incident. So having a good job, having a good social support system, having a partner, all these things are increasingly unavailable to people who are self-selecting out of those institutions and those activities. And it's hard for a social scientist because those are unmeasurable events, right? We can't measure with data how people don't do something, right? And so again, it's been hard to leverage research in a productive way to try to change public policy on this. And then finally, the criminal justice system is a racialized system, and it disproportionately impacts people who are poor, who are sick, who are not white. And the way that records are amplified on the internet now is just reinforcing these structural inequalities and the problems in the criminal justice system. But they're even exacerbating them more because privacy capital isn't taken into account, right? So when people are going to leverage their legal rights or their privacy rights, they're coming from a privileged position. They can articulate those rights, they can send the threatening email, they can do things in a way where a privileged person who is arrested is going to have a much easier time dealing with their digital trail than a person without privilege. And so you can see how the publicity of these records is just expanding these entrenched problems with the criminal justice system. And I think I'll stop there. Those are sort of the themes I wanted to hit on, and I'm really happy to, I know we're going to open it up to talk about legislative solutions to this, because this is not necessarily all doom and gloom. Things are actually changing in a really positive way. So I'll be happy to talk about that with everyone.
I don't know if maybe you have some questions, or should we?
Might. Maybe we could just start by sort of talking generally a little bit about the kind of definition and value of privacy, and how that's kind of changed since the advent of the internet, kind of generally and also specifically how it pertains to criminal records. And I know Sarah's written a bit about the kind of shape-shifting criminal record as well, how it sort of evolved from being something that was a single entity to something that's now kind of like multitudinous and very hard to control. And I guess that probably pertains to a lot of aspects of like our internet life and presence. So maybe we could just start by sort of thinking about that as a way of then trying to understand how that can be offset in relation to freedom of information.
Yeah, I think so. I'll start with sort of like the tactical answers. Like the question I had when I came to this research was like, how is this stuff getting on the internet in the first place? This doesn't like make sense to me, right? And some of the websites, like they kind of look like they're a background checking website, or they look like a news website, but they're not either of those. They are kind of what are called people search websites, which are these public records aggregators, not held to any sort of federal regulation. Or like mugshots.com has rebranded itself as mugshots.com news, like they wrote news on their logo, and it's an interesting, the website operators have been criminally charged with extortion in California, and right after their arrests, this is when the website changed. But I think, I used to think of a criminal record, and a lot of people, advocates and attorneys, and think about a criminal record as this like one single file, as this thing that it's sort of binary. Either you have one or you don't. And we think that there's like this big FBI database, and you go and put in somebody's name and you get the record. And it is so far from the truth, not only because of the private sector influence, but also just because of the way that the criminal justice system is fragmented. So a person who is processed through the criminal justice system is having contact with databases at the police level, at the county jail level, at the county court level, at the prison level if they have that kind of sentence, probation, maybe parole, and then community supervision, and maybe some sort of registry, depending on the type of crime. So if you think about it, that's 10 different sources of an official government record for one person. And there's been pushback by criminal justice agencies to streamline these things because they're political entities, right? The prosecutor's office and the police department have different political and social and legal goals. So they don't streamline these things. And in the past, records existed in practical obscurity. And this has been our safeguard for privacy when it comes to public records and transparency. It's been the way that we can access information about government but still give people a little bit of a barrier. So when you used to need to look at a mugshot or a court record, you could go to a jail and you could say, let me see the mugshots from today, and you'd flip through them, and if you were a member of the press, you could request it and it would get printed, and that was it. Or if you wanted a court file, you'd go to a court. You'd have to figure out what court it was, where the file was stored. You'd have to maybe pay for it or ask for it. And those practical barriers are what gave people privacy. It's the digital bulk nature of records now that has really just wiped that away. And so the idea of privacy is not an express right in the Constitution. It's a shadowy concept, as the justices have put it. But paper gave us a better handle on that right. And so there's something very unique about digital records that requires us to rethink what privacy and transparency mean. And the right to be forgotten is this excellent model for how that might work. So maybe you want to just talk a bit about how privacy fits into that.
Yeah, well, I think this project also is like, yeah, it is about kind of like philosophy of the internet and like some other legal issues, and definitely how the notion of privacy has been changing, but and then the notion of transparency too on the internet has been changing, because there are definitely, you know, understanding of transparency that come from this idea of open government that are totally legit. And then they have been applied to the internet with great enthusiasm in terms of like, oh, finally we can, you know, hold institutions accountable because we can look at what they are doing and all this data information about their activities public. But then we reached also a point that's actually pretty recent when we had to face the point that there might be too much information on there, and we don't want that level of transparency too on the internet. And that, I think it happens actually, it's like a little bit off topic, but with WikiLeaks, somehow the idea of radical transparency was really pushed to a point that it was just like something that would have been improved the world, that would have made everything better, and no one would felt shame because everyone could look at each other past and so on. But then we reached really like when we understood that actually some information shouldn't be public in the first place. And that's also the notion of in privacy is also that kind of misunderstanding to me between what is privacy and surveillance. Sometimes are like very two different notion ideas, but sometimes they are connected. And so in this case, to me, when you have the kind of data, criminal records online, it became a sort of surveillance because you can be tagged, and that label that you have on you is gonna, you know, be following you forever. And yeah, in the social context, but also, you know, in the, you know, whoever is trying to surveil you, from corporate surveillance to state surveillance. And everyone that tried to oppose the ceiling of these digital criminal records are actually activists that would be very active on surveillance issues, but they don't understand how this is a surveillance issue, and is actually one of the worst, because once you label people, you're able to label people, and that data, this labeling ends up in the wrong hands, then, you know, the consequences could be very bad. And so, yeah, I think there is a very like a difficult way. I mean, like people are still very confused, and also internet activists are very confused. And actually with this project, I had to face this kind of like kind of contrast and conflicts about these notions. And one of these is the right to be forgotten, which is this legislation that in Europe, but also in other countries, let people remove some results from the search engine. So basically, it's a very specific law that is very tackling search engines like Google. And you as a citizen, if you're European, and there is something that you don't want to be found, you can write Google and say, please remove this picture, or remove this these articles that was written on me, or this story, or like, you know, a blog that writes something about you. And Google will look at that and say, well, yes, you probably have the, you know, this is something that probably should be removed. But they would also say, no, look, you're a public figure, you're a politician, and this was a corruption case, so we're not going to remove it. Which is great common sense, but still is Google deciding it. And so that makes it this piece of legislation a little bit problematic. But also you should consider that how many politicians are going to try to hide their crimes? Probably a few. But how many, in America especially, criminal records should be expunged from the internet? 80 million. And what is the impact of that? That let's say 80 million, but maybe they're 40, okay? But 40 million might be able to move on in their life and find a job. And those politicians, yes, I mean, maybe they will be able to hide one crime they've done, but anyhow, they're corrupted politicians, but anyhow, that's the right to remove, and the right to remove try to be very more specific on that and suggest in the States we should have a right to be forgotten on only very specific category of informations, and only some particular type of people should be able to enjoy that right. And these people are people with criminal records that maybe have been already expunged in the real life, or maybe, the case was dismissed, or maybe it was 20 years ago, and there is no reason why that should show up on Google. But what happens that internet activists that really believe in this sort of radical transparency, they would oppose and say, no, in America there shouldn't be any right to be forgotten. And the journalists should have, it's not really about the journalists, but the publishing industry, the media, should be able to publish whatever they want. Because that's the First Amendment in America, and it's the most important amendment in this country. And so the notion of privacy is, is really perceived differently. And that's also why this project became kind of like, this kind of artistic intervention in this cultural understanding of what is privacy and the judgment of people online. And so it became also really a philosophical debate to some degree.
And in terms of practical solutions, not to go fully into that, but just as you were working sort of actively on the sort of campaign as it was kicking off, were you able to find some recourse for people? So to what extent could people actually, get those records removed? Because obviously I bore witness to a lot of the emails as well. So Paolo kindly let me into his sort of trove of emails that he'd received while he was working on Obscurity, and I went through and selected a lot of those, which are now displayed on the screen. So those are all real emails coming up on the left from people telling their stories. And I know that there were some people who you did try to help and who you got in touch with Google on their behalf, and I'm wondering to what extent you found yourself able to actually intervene.
I think was surely trying to inform them, simply just saying sometime that they shouldn't pay because these sites ask a removal fee to remove those pictures, and usually when you pay, and sometimes hundreds, but sometimes they become thousands of dollars, they might remove it from one site, but as soon as they see that you are willing to pay, they will republish it on another site. So sometimes just like a simple information like that to say, don't pay them, don't write to them, go through other ways. That's already very important because eventually they just pay and then they just get tricked forever in a way. So that kind of general information and the fact, that there are some forms they can write, there are some techniques in a way, and then simply just the mailing list, just pointing them to the fact there are other people that went through that, and if they have very specific questions, they can ask to, and they can figure and get support of any sort, and that's really it. Unfortunately, I mean, now things have been changed, and there are few law, and Sarah can talk about that, but there's not much you can really do.
Yeah, there's been people have different strategies, and one is to just sort of create noise in their own Google search results. So I've spoken to people who will just start a lot of accounts with their full name and try to have those stack up first, or even write about things that are kind of tangentially related to criminal justice so that those results come up first. So there's a DIY thing, but of course that takes a certain level of comfort with the internet to sort of puzzle through how you can manipulate your own SEO. We're witnessing a huge rise in clean slate and expungement legislation across the states, partly because of decriminalization of marijuana. California was sort of the leader here, saying if we're going to legalize this, what are we going to do with all these records that people are living with? So there's been efforts by people like us to try to attach a bit of privacy protections to clean slate legislation so that people not only have a legal remedy, but they have sort of a real life remedy as well. There's been laws passed about the takedown fees, and those laws are great, I think, to try to shut down the websites that really, really monetize this. It's really hard for people to actually use those laws. Like in Florida, if a website is charging you money, you have to like go to a courthouse, you have to pay to file suit against them, and then you have to find their mailing address, and these websites don't have mailing addresses, as you might imagine. And then, so you basically have to police these laws on your own, which again takes significant effort. And so we're starting to see some of the frameworks in place to help people, but it really is a burden that people carry on their own. And I think the role of Google is important here because if we can't change the laws and where we're not going to convince criminal justice agencies to make more records private, the way that we have with like victims' names and juveniles and grand jury targets, there are privacy protections in parts of the criminal justice system. But if we can't change those laws and we can't mess with the First Amendment, Google has taken a position on this that they're sort of an innocent aggregator, right? That whatever pops up is just the algorithm doing its thing. But they've dealt with revenge porn, and they've dealt with bail bonds, and they've dealt with payday loan companies, and they've stopped letting certain types of businesses advertise. There's measures that could be done. It's just that we're talking about criminal justice, and the way that criminal justice is so central to American culture has made this very difficult to push search engines to take part in just changing their own policies around it in lieu of changing the laws.
And do you think it's kind of been almost just a shape-shifting thing as well for a lot of those websites, like the kind of mugshots.com? Because when I was starting to research, I noticed that there were these huge numbers of sites related to reputation management, which seems to be kind of like the new byword for basically the same practice. And they ask people to pay them X amount of money, and they'll help them to essentially like reinstate their reputation as it was before, which is basically cleansing their records. Is that kind of the same thing?
Yeah, we've both sort of marveled at this new industry that has emerged from the mugshot extortion industry, which is reputation management. And there's been some lawsuits filed, and in discovery, it's been revealed that the same person sometimes owns the mugshot website and the reputation management website. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because how could some websites magically compel a mugshot website to change their content when the subject can't compel them to do that? And so the money's still being made, it's just being made in a sideways manner. I think these people search websites are also a massive problem. They've skirted regulation by saying that they put these disclaimers everywhere, saying you have to pay for this background check, and a lot of it is criminal record stuff and sometimes social media. And you have to click through these disclaimers saying, but you cannot use this for an employment decision, you can't use this for a volunteer application, you can't use this, it's only for your own curiosity. And the thing that, and once you use a record like that for an institutional decision, then you're held under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and it has to be, there's a lot of sort of levels to that in terms of the subject having some rights over or the information and the accuracy of it. And one easy switch would just be to take these websites and these reputation management websites, these people search websites, and hold them to the same standard that we hold like official background check companies to. It'd be a very clean way to kind of fix some of that. But it's the internet, right? And things pop up, and when people are trying to cope with this, they're really scared. And the more official a website can make themselves look just by design, the more likely people are to think that they're actually going to a source that can help them, and instead they're being manipulated even further.
Yeah, these are all great solutions to tackle this reputation company and so on, but it's just the amount of data is so huge. I mean, if you think how many people can really afford to, or like they even know how to write to a lawyer, or they know about the idea of reputation online. I mean, we're talking about America, where like there are homeless people, like mental health issues, they're so spread. I mean, we're talking about millions and millions of people. So even the ones that wrote me, they're really a tiny portion of people affected, for sure. There are the only very few that know how to write, first of all, and address and understand these things. So I think this is a massive amount of criminal records out there, and the only way to solve it is like just having like a kind of a radical fix by eliminating all of them in a way from the search results. That's it. Also because they're also so old. I mean, even if you tackle now, the jail and these data brokers and the software and so on, you make new legislations, it's too late because there's been it's a leak of data, and it concerns like millions of people, and it's data that's it's 20 years old, even older. So the only way to, and Google does that, because when there is like a leak, a data breach, and that data ends up on the internet, public internet, Google would filtrate that and would like keep that out. So I think that's why I think that's the only solution, because even if you pass the new law or to stop the county jail to publish new mugshots, or you win a class action against the jail or whoever or the site, that data is out there, and that generation of people is going to be affected for all their life. So I think that's the reality too.
Maybe just to return back to go into some of the implications of those records, and as you were saying, like the way that they kind of pop up on people. And there was a New York Times article that Paolo had sent me about why you can no longer get lost in the crowd, which is part of their Privacy Project series, which is very good. And in it, the authors kind of describe how obscurity as a concept is so crucial to personal growth and civic participation and kind of democracy itself, and that there should be some kind of right to make mistakes also, that without, not serious mistakes perhaps, but to an extent without ramification. And they say, the problem, knowing that though, is that in our status-obsessed culture, it can be hard to appreciate that the opposite of obscurity isn't fame, but chillingly oppressive fear. I guess I wondered if you could talk a little more about the idea of fear and how that relates to certain types of engagement, and also maybe the question of recidivism as well, because obviously a lot of those institutions factor in very much to people's tendency or propensity to reoffend, right?
Yeah, it's the digital avoidance is what I've kind of been thinking of it as, of the many, many people that I've talked to, has been really startling to me, because it feels like such an out of control and confusing problem. You cannot figure out the source of where all these pictures of you and these arrest records are coming from, that people are just so exhausted by it that they just pretend it's not there. And then they go try to find a legal remedy like expungement. And there's a lot of misinformation because people think they can go through the courts and they can get this expungement and it's going to fix everything else. So I did a lot of field work at expungement clinics, and the first question is always, so it gets expunged off Google, right? And the lawyers they feel helpless, and they want to encourage people to get the expungement because it helps with housing and occupational licensing. But they can't help them with this very practical problem. And so people have a couple choices, and one that I see a lot is that they just don't engage online at all. And I don't know, it just sort of brings into question this idea of the extent of punishment and how long do we really want to punish somebody, especially when it's about an accusation, right? And so what attaches to an accusation now, a public accusation, is incredibly long-reaching. And it's this idea that no matter how small your crime was or how overly policed the neighborhood you happen to be walking through is, that you should pay for this. And this has been a thread in the criminal justice system for a long time. This is what part of sentencing, like very populist-driven sentencing policy has been about in the 80s and 90s, is that we take the things we don't like about the world and we use the criminal justice system to punish everybody else because we're so unhappy with how things are unfolding in society. And so in many ways, I give talks about this to kind of like old school criminologists, and they're like, well, this has always been happening, right? So they're like, they tell me I got nothing new. It's just that it lasts longer on the internet. And I do think they have an important point there, because we've used the criminal justice system in such ugly ways in lieu of actually coping with some of the problems that we have in the country. And so this is certainly part of it. And this idea that punishment lasts a lifetime is just a way for us to say, you're not allowed to participate in society, you're not welcome here. And I have this file that proves it, right? I have this legal document that legitimizes my discrimination. And so I think that really undercuts the whole point of the rehabilitative ideal of the justice system. It sort of eliminates the need to have sentencing reform or to shorten sentences or to do all these things that we are trying to do to make the justice system more humane, when the cultural message is still you're going to be labeled as such for the rest of your life. And I also think we tend to focus a lot of the conversation on sort of the record subject, and what's interesting is that a criminal record doesn't say that much about an arrested person. It says a lot about who the police decide to arrest, and I think that's an important message for the public to try to wrap our heads around. It's that this isn't telling us about the moral quality of a person. It's about their likelihood of being stopped by the police in many ways. So those are kind of the ways I think about this in terms of what the criminal justice system is supposed to be doing in this very philosophical sense, as it's been created.
Yes, it's it reminds me the idea of mercy and forgiveness and how that can be applied on the internet, and how that doesn't really match, at least so far. Like the idea that you can forgive someone on the internet, or you can give mercy to someone, it's just not in our culture yet. And with the right to be forgotten, it's very clear that it just feels the internet is a place where you can scream only and name people and point finger at this point. Doesn't seem a place where you can forgive someone. It's like somehow we developed this idea of internet, this instrument. But what I was going to say is I don't remember. Pretty much, I think that's also very important. And I remember the context. So that's the problem with the internet technology. That's reduce the social context to some degree, as you were saying, that you cannot understand the values of someone, the human values of someone on the internet, and why that person was arrested, or why they committed a crazy crime, and all those social nuances disappear with technology. And people that believe in AI, or believe in this kind of exposure of information about someone, I think they are delusional in a way, because that kind of stuff is always going to be mediated, and if you don't meet this person and you don't try to understand and contextualize their histories, you're not going to be able to judge anyone. And those are instruments that could also be open on the internet, because there are many solutions to me, but one could be also that if there is a criminal record that really need to be public, because maybe it's a rapist, okay, and that probably needs to be public, but also you need to contextualize that when that crime happened, how long was, how, and all that kind of stuff is not present. And if you provide tools to do that, and you maintain it accurate, then people can understand what really happened. And journalists can write about it, and people can understand. But otherwise, it's just labeling. Yeah. That's it.
So maybe we can go from there into just talking about the kind of ongoing debate now around kind of freedom of access to information versus being able to seal public records, and maybe where we are in New York State, especially in light of Cuomo's mugshot ban, as it was called. And there was a lot of debate around that. And even particularly from institutions like the ACLU, who still wanted to support the idea of open records as a way of, again, like you said, holding police accountable, and also for journalistic access. So maybe you guys can both sort of speak to how we can kind of understand, that debate and the sort of how the value of privacy weighs up against the other.
I say only a couple of things, and then you know much better about this legislation. When I published this Obscurity project, there is a feature where you can still actually look at how many people were arrested in a specific county, and some kind of data is still public and it's accurate. So it didn't obfuscate all the data. For instance, you can see You can see how many people of color, the ethnicity, the gender, and so on. But that is not associated to the real name and to the real picture. So it's so simple, So the ACLU and those organizations, they can still hold accountable law enforcement without exposing the name of these people. They just can count other kind of data and, mask other kind of data. So sometimes very simple as that. And on the media side, the proposal of Cuomo was very opposed by some media organizations in New York that wrote very crazy editorial, and they were very against the proposal of Cuomo. They were trying to understand that this was a criminal justice issue, but then they said, oh, if these pictures are not going to be published anymore, we are going to live in a secret society. They were very exaggerating. Why they didn't really understand that anyhow the law enforcement are not going to publish all the story anyway. They publish just name and surname and a picture, but they don't really show the story. So even in any way, that's something else. That's what they should have pushed. And that for us as the organization Right to Remove was actually kind of challenging because we had to reply. We made this press release, or anyhow we tried to mobilize about that, and we have to mobilize against the media in New York, which sounds to me as an activist, political activist. Usually the medias are your friends. In this case, they became your enemy, or someone you had to contrast to support a politician that actually is trying to do something good. Not perfect, but actually do a good step towards something. And so that's, those are the challenges here in doing this project too, in a way. But thanks God, anyway, things are been happening too, right?
Yeah, so the mugshot ban was interesting, and I think a misleading line that's been used over and over is what Paolo said, is that this is how we get police accountability, is through mugshots. And I just think that's a really creative trick on the public, because what we need is we need bulk de-identified data. We need to know where arrests are happening and what kinds of people are being arrested. To individualize it to a person's home address isn't telling me anything about the police. It's telling me about where this person lives. And so there's been this idea that police brutality will be revealed through mugshots. And I just don't believe that. As long as law enforcement has the right to publish a mugshot, they've always had the right to not publish a mugshot. It is a curated set of information. It is not bulk data in the sense of watchdogging, doing statistical analyses to figure out how police are operating. And so what we should do is if transparency is this important when it comes to policing, then we need to start demanding that kind of data. Prosecutorial data. Prosecutorial discretion is like the black box of criminal justice. We have no idea what happens in that office when people are arrested and they get to the charging phase. And yet we have digitization of the court docket so that I can read where a person lives, what charges were leveraged against them, if they were dismissed, but it still exists online, right? And so this, we've kind of been misled, I think. We have this lens of what we think is access to public records, but we're getting access to records about people, not about institutions. And so, the nice thing about what's been happening in New York is that it started a national conversation about the different ways that levels of government can deal with this. So one is having Cuomo's told police departments and jails that they are not to publish mugshots unless there's a law enforcement interest. And some newspapers published hundreds of mugshots the next day and said, we have a law enforcement interest for every single one of these, right? It's discretionary, but in some ways I think that was important for people to see. How a new regulation can kind of be wiggled with immediately. And New York is actually doing a nice job because the city and the Office of Court Administration does not sell bulk data to background check companies that many court systems do. You can request a single court record and you have to pay for it, so that practical obscurity is alive and well when it comes to New York criminal justice. And other states are mobilizing around this as well, and so it's sort of a piecemeal approach, but I do think that New York has been showing up as a leader in this.
Yeah, you just told me that actually the New York City, not the New York State, figured something with mugshots.com, or they sue mugshots.com. So what was they had the litigation directly with the site?
Yeah, so there's a case you can look up where in mugshots.com, they would try to scrape data first. And if they couldn't scrape the data off a publicly accessible website, they would send in a FOIA or FOIL request. And the New York court said, no, like, what is this? What do you need all this data for? And so it was litigated. It went to a court here in New York, and privacy won on that. And it's incredible how these sort of small decisions in a court somewhere that we don't know about protected thousands and thousands of people from having these records bought and sold in a private marketplace and attached to their name on Google search results forever. So there's, if you get into it, you can find these small victories, and our goal is to kind of keep tracking those so that we can provide some sort of model legislation as things move forward.
It seems also like this very political decision in a way, because of course New York City is very Democrat, and they're trying to apply criminal justice reform and so on. But if you look at Arizona or Texas or Florida, and you look inside the small county jail or sheriff, you talk to them, they won't apply anything like that. And sometimes even if there is a law, as you said, sometimes it's not enforceable. Yeah. So because anyhow it's still public data. So it's like there might be some cases where though some state you get fined, and then I don't know if you want to talk about this class action you were involved to. That's very fascinating. There was they were Mugshot from 1960 or
So one sort of victory, depending on your side of all this, was just this summer in Pennsylvania. There was a class action lawsuit in a federal court there. And Bucks County, Pennsylvania was sold a software system to manage their inmates at the county jail. And part of it, an add-on that they had very casually purchased, was to do an online jail roster. And you could essentially click a button and it would put up the entire jail archive. So everyone who was processed through this jail from the 1930s to the 2000s got put on the internet on one day. And mugshots.com monitors these county websites, so they immediately attached an automatic scraping tool right into the website. So they were getting a daily feed of the new admissions to the jail, and then also publish this archive. And so this guy was living in Pennsylvania, and his family, his brother called him from Canada and was like, were you arrested 12 years ago? And it was very shameful in this family, and they're religious and professional, and it just was utterly devastating for him to be outed. He was not charged with the crime. It was actually a wrongful arrest. It was there was a restraining order, and he was essentially the victim and had to go to the jail for a couple hours. And then a decade later, his photo went on the internet, so he became the class representative. And there's been a lot of attempts to do a class action lawsuit, and they have always failed because they're expensive. It's not a very popular topic. People are freaked out by it. They don't want their name to go back into the court record. There's a huge chilling effect. Like, why would you want to go back into a courtroom and get put on the public record again, right? If your whole life has been trying to deal with the stigma that already exists. So the case made it through, and it was a very interesting reading of a Pennsylvania state law that exists to regulate rap sheets. So compiled criminal histories actually have a privacy added to them in about half of the U.S. Pennsylvania has a nice law, and the law was originally designed so if you worked at a jail or something and you had access to criminal records, you couldn't just take one and share it with your buddies. It was a way to try to police the behavior of people who worked in the system. But this judge, she interpreted that law in a digital context, and she said, no, the county violated this Pennsylvania state law when they put all these arrest records on the internet. So it was a jury trial in May, and the plaintiffs won a $68 million lawsuit because the Pennsylvania law does have damages in it, which makes it a very unique law. So if your record is illegally disclosed, a jury can decide to award you $100 to $1,000 per violation. So it's, of course, the county's appealing because it would actually bankrupt this county in Pennsylvania, but Paolo and I were discussing that this is the kind of chilling effect that actually could work for privacy, right? So how do we go on a speaking tour to the County Sheriff's Association and say, we understand why, as a public safety measure, you want to put these mugshots online, but is it worth $68 million to you? Because this law that you have on the books is being reinterpreted, and it started in Pennsylvania. It might happen in your state. And so it was a creative and interesting way to interpret the law that I think was very much in the spirit of understanding how public records law should work today. So the case is called Taha v. Bucks County, if you want to look it up.
Were there any other kind of like practical legislative solutions that are worth thinking about? Because in some of the research I was doing, I hit upon a few things like even in certain states there'd been laws passed about actually changing the nature of the police precinct websites so that they couldn't be scraped, for example. And I was wondering, sort of how realistic that might be as a kind of, obviously large scale is quite difficult to implement, but are there other kind of things like that can work, on a smaller scale maybe, and start to take hold?
I think we talked about that, right? No, there actually was also a case in the class action. I remember when we were talking about with the lawyer, and he talked about the CAPTCHA or like some technical stuff they didn't want to implement. So it was actually negligence.
Yeah,
they were accused of negligence.
Yeah, part of the class action. Yeah, we had dinner with one of the attorneys, and a part of it was actually looking at the architecture of government websites, and so a lot of government websites, they're not web designers, right? They have a third party come in and build a website for them, and so inserting protections against the data has been something that is increasing and could be regulated, could be required by the states. So I think the easiest technical solution for a lot of this is to not allow bulk downloads or scraping, right? So just you can do a targeted search. You have to know the full name of the person whose information you want to find. Just that small bit of that small barrier could do so much without disrupting this idea of having access, because the laws haven't changed. You used to have to drive and park or take the subway to a courthouse and go through all this like physical labor to get something. Requiring someone to know the first and last name of a record subject would be a technical solution, as well as the CAPTCHAs and all these things. I think that pre-conviction records are low-hanging fruit here. So if we do have a public's right to know, you can imagine a scenario where you have de-identified arrest data so that we know how the police are operating. Cook County in Illinois has now made available bulk data about prosecutorial decision making without people's names and addresses, but with the attorneys' names, right? So actually having some sunshine in the places where we desperately need it. And then if conviction records need to be publicly available, they can be regulated. Every state already has a regulatory body for putting together rap sheets because they have to report them to the FBI for national background checks. They could basically from the top down say, police departments, jails, courts, all of you stop publishing your own criminal records and versions of it. Let the repository do its job. And so there's definitely been some movement there at different state levels to try to again, just sort of centralize things and have it to be for conviction records. So these rap sheets, they don't report arrests that did not lead to criminal charges. They don't report charges that were dismissed. They don't report expunged records. So we have some of the framework in place. It's just trying to get the police and the court records to become not part of this criminal record canon in the way they are now.
Yes, and on the other layer of Google, nothing really changed. I think this is connected to other, like revenge porn law, for instance, that took very long time to be applied. I think now in this day, most of the states in US have revenge porn law happening, so you can ask Google to remove some stuff. But that took years. I mean, some states didn't want that either. And for instance, only California until today has a law that let you remove all data about when you were a minor. Mm-hmm. And that's also, to me, incredible. That's only one state that let you do that. And and the right to be forgotten is not really an option. And one day, actually, we went to meet this lawyer that was the only lawyer that I know that managed to sue Google for a revenge porn case. And he wasn't even American. It was like an African lawyer working upstate, and he was very nice to listen to our case. And but he was saying, "Well, guys, don't try." He was saying, "Well," because we were trying to sue Google like through this project in a way, or at least like just make a provocation, but. He was saying, yeah, you can try, but or you're very serious, and or you have also the resources behind you. It would be very hard. And then yes, there is also, as you said, there is also that chill effect for the plaintiff, because that's also the problem. I mean, if you have a criminal record, why would you go back and sue some mugshot sites so that your name is again back? It's about your crime and eventually you didn't even commit, but you will be remembered for that forever. So it's basically sacrificing yourself for something that you wanted to be removed from your past. So that's also why it's very difficult. And most of those lawsuits, not the class actions, but the lawsuit against the individual mugshot sites, they're settled, right? So. Yeah. And that's also why it has been so hard, because they don't go in discovery, and so you don't know, how much they make, because I don't think we even know how much mugshots.com has been making. Maybe there were millions, and we don't even know that when you talk about transparency in this country. We don't actually even know what is their business and structure behind. So that's it.
Did you want to show anything from the project, or
actually,
maybe not?
No, but I think you should definitely enjoy the installation. And Elizabeth did this amazing work, and we should find a way to keep this somewhere of reading a lot of emails that I received, and redacting them and making a selection. So those are very interesting. And then there are 2 legal letters, and one is from mugshots.com that I received, I think 2 years ago already. And it's a very funny, interesting piece of reading, because it's a kind of a legal threat, and it's addressed to me, and they say that they would sue me in any country I live if I don't stop what I am doing. But funny enough, after 2-3 months, they sent that letter. Well, first actually I got a little bit scared, and I did took down the site. Because it was basically saying, if you don't do that, we are going to sue you. And so I did that. And then I waited a little bit, and then I felt very moved about this project, and I republished it again, which is something I never done before, because every now and then I receive one of these letters, and usually I do whatever they ask me, because I don't want to get sued for real. In that case, this project was like moving me so much. I said, okay, no, I don't care. Even if they sue me, this worth to do it. And so I republished it. And after a few months, I republished that. They got arrested. So there was this news of themselves being arrested wherever in Florida. That was very funny to me. Okay, cool. No worries anymore. And then there is also another legal threat that I received from another company that's called Data US Ltd, something like that, of another couple of sites. So basically, there are few of these operators, I don't know how you want to call them, and I think they are connected by such shady business. We actually don't know what they are. I mean, there are some people that, they're always mentioned, but I think it's broader than that. And also, we don't know the ramifications, if they are connected to some data broker situation, or like bigger business of trade of data, or who knows what else, any kind of business you can do with that. And so that's pretty much, and then another piece of the documentation is actually the list of sites, of mugshot sites, that is also very interesting, and it came out from this project because people simply reporting from where they found the mugshots, I could actually assemble the list. And I don't know, I think it's basically 100 websites, because we always talk about mugshots.com, but actually there are so many, and they keep opening. So it's actually, sometimes some site get in trouble legally, and so they just open a new domain, they have a new logo, and they have already the data, so they republish everything under a new name, and they can charge people through that new site. And so that's why it became a long list, and it's very crazy because some sites are very specific, local. Yeah. So it's like, the county, blah, 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 and .com. And so everyone living in that county all of a sudden found, as the site, and it's kind of just like public shame for everyone. So yeah, this is like actually it's a small portion of what the project is, but it's definitely some of the best. And then the sites themselves are not really online because also technically it became very difficult to maintain sites with a million records, and this project wasn't really supported by any organization, and anyhow also became too overwhelming for me to maintain those sites online because all these emails I was receiving and staying behind was very hard. At the same time, the sites themselves changed, so mugshot.com changed the logo and so on. So I think the point was made, and so it's out there for everyone to use. But still, with the right to be removed, I still receive people telling that people still write and people still mention new websites. So to today, every day, let's say, I receive someone that tell me a story about the mugshot sites and how they destroy their life. So it's still happening right now, even if all this legislation passed and so on. But the sites are so many, and there are so many people that are being affected. So it's still happening.
Okay.
Well, thank you for being here. Thank you so much
Thanks so much, everyone.
hosting us.
Thank you, Paolo and Sarah, so much for being here.